Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by Kate Parker, who is a volunteer at Sea Sheppard. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. I was reading a rather depressing article about the Chinese squid fishing fleet, and I wanted to know more about it. So I was like, I met Kate once at a heavy metal concert in Australia, and here you are now. So thanks for taking the time.
Of course.
How long have you been a volunteer at Sea Shepherd for?
Yeah, I joined Sea Shepherd in 2015, and yeah, just met them through a chance showing of a documentary that they had, and was totally inspired by some of the volunteers there. And at that time, some of the Sea Shepherd vessels were docked in Williamstown in Melbourne, and they invited me to come along and join them doing like ship tours of the vessels. And I just learned so much about the organization. At that point, I started doing volunteering with them myself. So doing the fundraising, which is like how I met you, with selling t-shirts and things like that at gigs. And then, yeah, just sort of snowballed from there until I put in my application to join the ships and go offshore on various campaigns that I've been on since. So yeah, I sort of started from 2015, I think it was. Yeah.
Wow. So what's your offshore volunteering comprise of? What's that look like?
Yeah, so the first campaign I went to Antarctica on our last Southern Oceans campaign. So I think Sea Shepherd is probably quite well known in Australia for our Antarctica campaigns, where we go and oppose the Japanese whaling fleet. So 2016, we set sail around about November and went down there to try and locate the Japanese whaling fleet and try to document everything that they were doing. So of course we caught them illegally whaling inside Australian marine territory, and we were able to send that image around the world and expose what's happening down there, and then also, you know, chase that fleet away and try and cost them as much money as possible and stop them from from catching whales for as long as possible. So that was my first campaign. And then since then I've done a bunch of different ones, but mostly in Mexico, where we're trying to save an animal from going extinct, but it is collateral damage when poachers are trying to catch a fish there that's worth, well, its swim bladder is worth more than cocaine on the Asian black market. So they're trying to catch that fish. In fact, it's all the cartel that used to run the drugs now are trying to catch this fish for its swim bladder and ship it back to Asia. And unfortunately, there's an animal going extinct there in the nets that they use. So
What's the animal?
Sea Shepherd. It's called a vaquita porpoise, and it's only found in that part of the world. And when I first went out there in 2017, they estimated there was between 30 and 50 left. Now they reckon there's less than 10 individuals left in the world. So we are on the brink of losing that animal. So Sea Shepherd has been working on that area now for 7 years, trying to save that poor vaquita from going extinct. But it's increasingly challenging, and the daily confrontation with the poachers is getting more and more violent. You might have seen some of our reports on that. So it's a very challenging space to be working in. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen the reports on that. And I'm familiar with you know, the broad strokes of drug trafficking in Latin America and the violence that's inherent in that. But I was unaware that cartels had branched out into poaching. And that strikes me as pretty dangerous for someone like yourself, who's not paid to do what you're doing. Is there a threat to life and limb?
There is a threat, yeah. That campaign in particular has changed a lot over the years. When I first started going, the poachers didn't really know who we were as an organization. And I must stress, we are invited by the government to be there. We're not just kamikaze going in. You know, the government have asked us to go in and help them to police their waters, essentially. And when we first went out there, they were much more afraid of us. They didn't really know who we were as an organization, but we're non-violent and we're non-aggressive. And over the years, they became more confident and then started attacking our ships, at which point we then had federal police and the army come on board with us. So we have armed guards on board our vessel to protect the Sea Shepherd crew, because it does get really violent. You know, there's daily attacks with Molotov cocktails and lead weights and things thrown at us. And we have had our vessel shot at and our drones shot out of the sky and things like that. So that one is particularly intense and it is unsafe, but of course we have our protection on board as well for the crew. So it's a difficult situation, but we have support from the local authorities to protect our vessels. Yeah.
Just thinking kind of laterally here, it strikes me that a lot of the drive for marine preservation and conservation work would stem if governments could look after people who are impoverished, like to take
Yeah,
the profit
definitely.
impetus
Yeah,
way. Is
yeah.
that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. It's a really complicated situation in a lot of these situations, and Sea Shepherd's a lot of work these days basically trying to empower local governments to police their own waters. So we do a lot of work off the coast of Africa and stuff, so we are supporting the governments in carrying out their own law enforcement, if that makes sense, because they don't necessarily have their own resources to do that. And yeah, I think government, it's a very political situation, but governments supporting their local communities better potentially could negate some of these risk factors. So in that area where we're working, you know, there are local fishermen who don't support what the poaching industry is doing, but because of the restrictions around fishing, they're feeling that they're unable to go out fishing, and the government had said that they would give them monetary handouts, but then they didn't do that in time, or they didn't provide enough. So then they feel like they kind of don't really have any other options other than to potentially move into that space of poaching to make money. So it's a kind of delicate balance between, you know, just straight up doing the right thing, but also supporting the local people in doing the right thing, in you know, not going down a road of illegal poaching. And to be honest, most of it just comes from greed.
Oh, really?
A lot of those big international organizations, you know, it's more about the greed that's driving it. There's a lot of money to be made. It's very unregulated, and so, you know, a lot of those international massive poaching organizations, like the ones that you were talking about, the squid fishing off Galapagos, they're, you know, the Chinese fishing industry is the biggest in the world, and it has the highest rates of illegal fishing that's going on there. So there's a lot of money to be made, and they often alongside have other activities, so drug trafficking, human trafficking, that kind of thing. It's a really huge global problem. Just, you know, when you eat fish or when you buy fish in the supermarket, you don't realize kind of what's gone on in the background. And it's just the same for any international organized crime. It's often just greed that is driving behind all of the crimes that are occurring. Yeah.
So when we were talking about the squid fishing, and we flip between poaching, and we talk about Chinese government.
Yeah.
Are you saying that what the Chinese government is doing is actually illegal under international law, or they're just tacitly supporting illegal fisheries?
Sorry, not the government, but the fishing fleets that they have are working illegally. So not the government. Sorry, I've jumped around a little bit, but the fishing fleets that go out and do a lot of that industrial level fishing are working often illegally. They might use different signs to cover up the identity of the vessel, or they might change their numbers and registration plates, so you don't know which the vessels are. And it's just really hard to police in international waters, such vast areas and those kind of things. So it would be good, same like with Antarctica, it would be good if some of the governments could step up and actually enforce heavier restrictions on people who are caught fishing illegally. But essentially, it's just very difficult to pin down and chase a lot of these operations because they're, you know, so hard to find in the great oceans, and hard to there isn't a police force that's as heavily available on the seas as there is maybe on land, for example. So these organizations get away with a lot of illegal activity because it just doesn't seem to be brought to justice, or it doesn't get reported, or there's a whole lot of criminal activity that's happening that we just don't see because it's so far out of sight and out of mind. And
who does police the sea? Is it every the territorial waters of every country is protected by the Navy and Coast Guard of every country, or is there like an international?
I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but as far as I understand it, you have your territorial waters that are policed by the marine laws that you have of the country that you're in. As far as I understand it, there are difficulties with that. So for example, in terms of like the IWC, which is the International Whaling Commission, they were trying to prevent countries from going whaling, and certain countries had to vote whether or not they wanted to be part of the not allowing people to whale in their waters or whatever. And certain countries had their votes bought off by other countries who were invested in wanting to continue whaling. So there's that kind of stuff that's happening in the background. So some countries will allow other countries into their waters to go fishing, not necessarily because they want to, but because they've been paid off in a different way. The government's been given a handout from the companies, like countries like Japan, for example, who might want to go into their waters and fish. So I'm not an expert on the ins and outs of the marine law, but I know that there's a lot of criminal activity that's happening. And even just in the sense of like, you know, you might have the waters that are part of your country that you're patrolling, but you can't be everywhere at all times. And if these guys are not using their AAS, which is the way that all ships are meant to identify themselves globally, if they switch that off, or if they use a different call sign. I mean, in what you were talking about with the squid fleet in Galapagos, what Sea Shepherd found was a lot of these vessels are using a call sign that's supposed to identify them, but it's actually, you know, a tugboat or a search and rescue aircraft, or, you know, they're using fake call signs so that they can't be found. So even within your own waters, it's difficult to find these vessels that are operating illegally. So yeah, it's up to the local territories to police them. And then I think there's vast areas of the ocean that just have no particular governance on them. You know, they're international ocean spaces that don't have anybody policing them per se. So.
And so then it's just wholesale slaughter of marine life.
Yeah.
I find that so bleak. I find that incredibly bleak because our seas are emptying, right? Like scientifically speaking, there are huge swathes of ocean which have been horribly overfished.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's like 90% of the world's fisheries are now either completely overfished or on the brink of collapse. It's a really, really very crucial issue that's happening soon. You know, Captain Paul Watson and other people will say when the seas die, we die, and that's absolutely true. And at the current rate, they predict there'll be no fish left in the ocean by 2048 if we don't do something about industrial fishing problem, which is, you know, not that long away. So and we need to change drastically.
When I think about climate change, I'm like, oh, I'll probably be dead. Like, I'll try my best to drive less, but I'll probably be dead.
Yeah.
But when we think about our seas dying, that's within our lifetimes.
For sure, yeah. And
I mean, both are obviously equally important, but it's I'm like, how do I prioritize what I think about, and how do I prioritize what I act on? And
yeah, well, that's a huge, even bigger question, isn't it? Like, there's so many things that are overwhelming in our lives. Like, how do we prioritize? But I think, you know, there are definitely ways that we can be more aware of what's happening, and we need more. You know, we need more change at a political level as well. We need more countries of the world to get on board with climate crisis and look at actually what some of the issues are that are affecting that, and make some positive steps to change that, because it really is on the brink of collapse. And you know, we are seeing already massive changes in our weather systems with, you know, bushfires and flooding and things like that, sea levels rising. A lot of our Pacific islands will be underwater like soon, very soon. So I think it's really important that we prioritize some of these issues, because we are on the brink of wiping ourselves out, unfortunately, as bleak as it sounds. Yeah.
Why do you do this? Why do you go off to sea by yourself for 3 months with a bunch of, I guess, sometimes strangers, get shot at by like Mexican cartels, unpaid? Like, what motivates you?
I guess it's just something that I'm really passionate about. It's something that I feel like I can actively do. I don't have, you know, I have the economical backing to do it. I have a well-paid job that allows me to go away for a few months every year to do it, and I realize how lucky I am in that. I don't have a family at home that I'm like worried about leaving behind. You know, I have the mobility and the capacity to go and help. So why wouldn't I guess? I love the oceans. I've always respected the oceans. And I have an opportunity that I'm very grateful for, where I can literally go to Mexico and pull some of those nets out of the ocean that are killing all of these species, and feel like, wow, I actually made a difference. Like, I didn't kind of sit at home and go, oh, that's terrible, I really wish I could do something about it. Like, I've been to Antarctica, and I was part of the team that ended up, you know, chasing the whaling fleet for so long that they couldn't catch whales the whole time we were doing. Like, I feel like I've achieved something to help towards this colossal problem. I suppose it's maybe, but it's very selfish in a way that I can feel a sense of achievement from that. But I would, I don't have any restrictions to stop me. So why wouldn't I go and help care for something that I feel passionate about, I suppose?
I don't think it's selfish at all. I think it's very selfless and admirable. So give yourself props. How does anyone who's listening to this or watching this, how do they get involved with either Sea Shepherd, or how do we, I feel like often when it comes to activism or change making, it's a handful of people doing a lot of work. But if we had many hands to make that work lighter, that would be more effective. How do we do that?
Yeah. So there's a whole spectrum of things that you can do, and some of them are a little more time or lifetime heavy, but some are pretty easy. So starting with the kind of macro end, like of course you can sign up to Sea Shepherd. We always need more crew. Jump on the Sea Shepherd Global or Sea Shepherd conservation pages, and you can come and help local government and enforce some of their fishing laws, or come and help us in Mexico trying to save this animal. So you can do that, or you can volunteer with local marine organizations in your area. So Sea Shepherd has that onshore component where we're fundraising, like how I met you. And if you're working full time and you don't want to go off to sea, then you can just help out selling a few t-shirts on a weekend and making the money that actually keeps our boats at sea. So without all of that fundraising, we wouldn't be able to do these campaigns. And there's lots of organizations, and Greenpeace and all these other organizations that you can get involved with that fundraising. But on that more kind of like micro level, even just sharing all of our posts, liking marine conservation groups, watching documentaries, educating yourself, I suppose, getting to know actually the truth behind what's going on. There's so many articles on the internet around like the illegal back end of international fishing. You can make people aware through what you choose to share on your social media platforms or the conversations that you have with your friends. But then you can also reflect a little bit in on your own voice through what you consume. So whether that's literally the consumption of sea animals, or whether it's through your consumption of plastics, which is also a big problem for our oceans. Thinking about trying to shop a little bit more locally, not just clicking on Amazon and things turning up the next day, and not thinking about your carbon imprint. There's lots of ways that your daily choices can actually, if we all made better choices on a micro level, we could actually make huge changes. And whether that's writing to your local MP and telling them that you're not happy with the recycling situation, or voting in the Greens government, whatever it is, there's lots of little things that you can do that don't require a huge change in your life to make quite big impacts for the planet, for the oceans, for climate, everything.
Yeah, that's very power in collectivism, right? If we have like an approach of solidarity, then that is going to have like a really hugely beneficial impact on protecting our environment. I struggle with that because I feel like so much of the conversation around social justice when it comes to like social issues in the humanities is quite individualized. Have you ever heard the phrase "the left will eat itself"?
I've heard similar things, but go on, explain that a bit more.
Well, we tend to fall into arguing with one another about like nuanced academic, or like, no, but what about this? Or like, you're not doing activism right, and particularly with social media, like there's so much room for misinterpreting someone that it becomes just like a shitty dogfight on the internet rather than a constructive conversation. So you said that people talking about these issues online can be a helpful tool. How would you encourage people to lead those conversations about maybe eating less fish or shopping locally in a constructive way, rather than go vegan or you're a piece of shit?
I mean,
what's your
this
advice
is a really
to that?
contentious issue. I mean, absolutely. And I think from my years in the activism sort of vegan space, I can completely hear everything you said. Just resonates so much, and it really grinds my gears to see people who are just working in that left space trying to get something done bashing other people working in that space, because we're all technically doing the same thing, but everyone gets so weighed down with the minutiae of how you're supposed to do it. And so I can give my opinion on what I think is a good way to go into that space. However, I know that I'll probably get bashed from a few different angles on, my opinions around that. What I would say is, again, it's a whole spectrum. Like in any organization, you're going to have extremists and liberals. You can have those extremist vegan views who are just like absolutely no tolerance. Everything must be completely, you have to change everything in your whole life is the only way we're going to have an effect. And they're, out on the streets, shouting and or delivering their message in a really explicit way, which I get, because sometimes shock is what we need to make people stand up and think, whoa, I need to make a change. But then there's also the softly approach. Then there's also the kind of having those kind of conversations, maybe changing one thing. I know a lot of vegans might say that one day a week meat free isn't going to make enough of a change. And I agree with that, but I'd rather see somebody one day a week making those changes than not at all. So I tend to come more from that softly end of the spectrum. Gently encourage, lead by example, have conversations without judgment. People, they might want to change certain things, but I have friends who say, I want to go vegan, but I couldn't give up cheese. So that's fine. Give up everything else apart from cheese. That's still going to make a huge impact in terms of the pressure that you've put on that agriculture system, even if you're still eating cheese. But I know there'll be vegans out there who will shoot me down in flames and say that's not the way, So it's a whole spectrum. And I think it's just about having, for me, on my personal journey, it's about having kindness and empathy and remembering that I've not been this way my whole life. I definitely didn't care about the environment. I used to eat all kinds of seafood and everything else, just because I'm this way now, I still remember what I used to be like. And I didn't, I appreciated people talking to me with respect and showing me by example how they live their life. And I slowly make changes every day, making different changes to become the person that I want to be, rather than sort of saying, right, you need to be like this 100% of the time. And if you fall off the wagon, you've broken the law and you're no longer good, and you're no longer an environmentalist, and you're no longer a vegan, whatever. We all have good days and bad days and everything. And so I would say, I would be somebody who would try to be more that empathetic, like encouraging others along their journey type activist.
Yeah, but that's what works. Like,
oh, well, yeah.
Being an asshole to people doesn't work. They just
Yeah.
tell you that you're an idiot,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll say some mean shit to you back, and then you're just like locked in your positions, hating some strangers, rather than building a bridge to get over it, right?
Yeah.
Good for you. That's really refreshing to hear. Because Sea Shepherd historically has been quite a militant organization.
Yeah.
Like, you were pirates, right?
Yeah.
Like, literally.
Yeah.
You would sink ships, if I'm correct, when you started, and physically confront people when they were killing seals on land. And
definitely, yeah. And look, we still do. We're a direct action organization. But I think the history, we just had our 40-year anniversary. This organization has been around for a long time. It's grown and it's evolved. And, I'm not an official spokesperson for Sea Shepherd, but I can share sort of how I've seen it change, even in just in the last few years since I joined. And, it did start out as just like one guy, Captain Paul Watson. He just got his boat and he wanted to go and do something. And he didn't want to wait for the governments to step into a space that they're probably not going to get into very quickly. And he went down to Antarctica and he rammed those ships, or he went to, Costa Rica and he caused problems. And that's how we got that reputation. But even just in the last few years, more and more, we're moving more into kind of a space where we're working much more collaboratively alongside different organizations, alongside different governments, and trying to be more that educational space, trying to enforce laws. We take direct action, but not so much maybe that militant kind of aggressive attitude that we used to have. We're definitely at the front line, but we're working more to incorporate everybody in that space and working with different organizations rather than just being kind of like off on our own, doing our own thing. Like I said, governments inviting us in to help support them to enforce their own laws. So yeah, it's changed for sure as it's gone over the years, and it's grown into this huge organization now. So lots of different things that we're doing. We're still on the front line, but perhaps not as aggressively as back in the day.
Yeah, that's cool. That actually is like an interesting it's analogous to what we were talking about with like how you talk about this shit on the internet. Like, you could be a hard out militant about it and like cause lots of upset and shock and or sort of approach to things, or you can be like a bit more moderate in your approach with the long-term aim of achieving the same outcomes. It seems that you've shifted from a more radical approach to a more not conservative, because your outcomes are still about shifting norms, but just a more constructive way to achieve these goals.
But I think that's the thing, is like going back to what we were saying before, you know, there is a whole spectrum, and I'm sure there's some like hardcore fans of Sea Shepherd who said that we've become too weak, or we've become too watered down. You know, this is the problem in that space. Like you said, the left will eat itself. It's the fear or the shame of doing, you know, what seems to be wrong, that like kind of hold a lot of people back. And even me talking about my particular views on how to be an activist, like me a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have publicly said that because I would have been so afraid of the backlash or whatever. And, you know, Sea Shepherd's not an organization who cares about the backlash at all. But, you know, I think in that general idea of like wanting to maybe change your tactics or do things slightly differently, I think you sort of have to get over all of these different opinions. And I'm sure there's lots of people who think that Sea Shepherd should still be ramming ships and sinking vessels and doing all those things, but that's just the nature of the beast. And I guess you've just got to stick to your own integrity and go with what you believe. And at the minute, you know, with Sea Shepherd, the teams are organizing the operations. Like, I respect the way that they've gone in the angle of, you know, we're almost like a consultative service that we will come and help you to do what you're doing, rather than just going in there and causing friction without the support of the people who patrol those waters or whatever it is anyway. So I think it's a much better direction, and I support it, but I'm sure there are people that think that we've got soft or whatever.
The phrase that springs to mind is sold out.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I would say, come with us to Mexico and get shot at by the cartel, and then tell us again we sold out.
Well, that's it too, because it's generally people. It's not always, but it's often people who aren't getting their hands dirty, who do take those, who do throw those criticisms.
Yeah,
they're not out there getting shot by fucking cartels or risking getting arrested, or even spending 3 months at sea. That must be like a shit time. Like I would definitely get motion sick.
Luckily, I don't. So that's probably one of the other reasons why I would be suitable to go on a campaign.
I'd be such a baby. I really respect what Sea Shepherd are doing. Do you work collaboratively with other organizations? Because initially Paul Watson was at Greenpeace, he was.
He was, and he broke away because he wanted to take more direct action. So that was, he comes from the same place. And that's exactly what we were talking about, like activists all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, but actually all doing different things. And I think at that time, Greenpeace was much more of a protesting type organization, maybe and again, all valid things, political activism, going into government and trying to make changes at a political level is also part and parcel and valid, or whatever. There are all different elements of activism that all together work towards trying to make these changes. But Paul Watson wanted to make a more direct, take more direct action. He didn't want to just hold up posters or go to rallies and things like that. And that's fine too. So he splintered away and set up Sea Shepherd. So Sea Shepherd does work with other organizations where we can, but mostly we're sort of concentrating on working with government fisheries organizations, and may need the support of their armies or navies to protect us in that space, but mostly working alongside local marine governments. Marine authorities within the local governments.
Cool. That's important too. I think often activists talking with activists kind of defeats the point. You need like the people who have their hands on the levers of power involved in the change making, unless you've somehow got some radical manifesto to try to overthrow the state, which I'm not entirely opposed to, but like that's not going to work right now, is it? Hey, you also have your own organization that's part and parcel of this conversation, which is Daughters of the Deep. What is that about?
That's right. Thank you so much for letting me talk about that one as well. So that's an organization that was launched earlier this year. So we're brand new. myself and a few friends. It was the brainchild of a good friend of mine from years ago who works in conservation diving. And he just noticed that in the area he was working in Nicaragua, there were so many young women who were curious and interested in getting into diving, but didn't necessarily have the kind of economic or social backing to be able to get into the marine conservation industry. Like they're not necessarily seen as part of that workforce. So Daughters of the Deep is an organization that's trying to address some of that gender imbalance. So we originally started out thinking that we might sponsor a few young women in those countries where they're not necessarily seen as part of that workforce to get their diving certificates. So we were looking at Indonesia and Thailand and Nicaragua. But it's sort of grown and blossomed into this kind of looking at gender inequality in the marine industries across all different sectors. So since we've launched, we've been looking at, there's a discrepancy between the number of women who are receiving grants for studying in marine sciences over men. There is, sadly, we've had a lot of women coming forward and sharing their stories around, sexism and sadly sexual assault in areas where heavily male dominated. So things like industrial level sort of technical diving and things like that, where you might have 90% men working in that industry. So it's kind of grown and evolved from, we're trying to address lots of different issues, but essentially the core of it is a gender imbalance in the marine industries. And why does that exist? What are the barriers for young women getting into that as a career? Why are there so few women working on boats? All of those kind of things. So yeah, it's an interesting journey. We just had our first initiative that we launched in Madagascar, where we sponsored a young woman to go to school, essentially, so that she could go on and get an education because she wants to go into marine sciences. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to afford her fees. Her granddad was paying, sort of supporting her, and he could no longer work. So she was facing not going to high school. And in Madagascar, often young women are married off to rich foreigners as a way to make money for the family. So she was kind of facing potentially being married off in that culture that's quite accepted. And so with the money that we've raised so far, we've paid for her education so that she doesn't have to, face that life. So that's been a really cool starting point for our organization, and we hope that we will be able to do lots of different outreach opportunities in different places in the world where we can select a few women and try and lift them out of the situation that they are in, or move them into a career in marine industries.
And what are the barriers to female participation in marine industries?
Well, that's what's really interesting.
Apart from cost,
yeah. Well, exactly that. So, and I think it's varied as to where it is. So, typically, cost, obviously. Culturally, in some places, women just aren't seen as part of the workforce anyway. They're just seen as child bearers, and that's quite a common situation across lots of different sectors, not just the marine industries. But yeah, so that's some of the challenges. But then even talking to other women that I've interviewed as part of this sort of gathering information for our media, I think that it's just one of those industries that is felt like it's a male dominated space. Like it's quite a physical thing, going out on the boats, dragging your tanks around, especially technical diving. I think that it's just so heavily dominated by men that women are just put off by the difference, and often in sort of diving, it's maybe older males who've perhaps retired, and that's seen. I used to work in diving in Melbourne, and it was mostly older males who's retired, and that was seen as their sort of like boys on the weekend type activity. I don't know. I'm not sure what the key barriers are, other than I don't know. There are some industries that are seen as a more masculine type activity. I guess ones that maybe are more physically demanding, potentially, and more dangerous. Things like if you wanted to be a technical diver, commercial diver on oil rigs in the North Sea, it's probably one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. So all of those kind of social pressures around women doing dangerous jobs and things like that, this is what we're trying to find out, because we do know that there are these massive discrepancies. And why is that? And what are those barriers, and how can we change that? Is it just that women aren't as visible in that space, so we're just not seen so much or taken so seriously? You look at the PADI website, PADI being one of the main people who certify divers. It's very heavily male dominated. I'm not attacking PADI, but it's quite tokenistic. You might have the quite pretty girl in one of the scenes with like 5 boys doing their dive certificate. I don't know that women in the diving space or women in the marine spaces are taken as seriously, like female captains. It's almost like, you know, when you go and have surgeries, sometimes like, you've got a female surgeon, like questioning, like, oh, well, goodness, how do you feel about that? It's like you get on a boat and you've got a female captain, or if you've got an airplane, oh, the captain's female. Suddenly people are like, oh, can a woman do that job? I think that happens across lots of different sectors, even to this day. And so we're focusing on the marine industry. But yeah, there's lots of barriers for women doing typically male jobs, I suppose. And that's something that we're trying to highlight and to address and to promote women doing amazing things in that space. There are incredible marine conservationists. There are incredible women working on boats or in commercial diving, and we're trying to celebrate them and bring them to the forefront so that women can see that this is a space that they should be able to get into and would not feel any prejudice or barriers.
Yeah, it is that representation thing in part, huh? Like when you see it, you can be it, right? Like, and that is an emerging conversation we've had across all manner of industries in the last, for a long time, but it's particularly with the, post Me Too era, we are really having this ongoing public conversation about, perhaps to use an overused phrase, diversity and inclusion. Yeah. Which is...
Do you feel like that tide is turning a little bit?
With women in the workplace?
To representation of women. Yeah. This is such a random thought, but I was Skyping with my nieces the other day, and they love Lego. They're 9 and 7. And, they had like a little Lego vet station or whatever, or I can't remember if it was a vets or doctors, but it was a woman who was the main character in it. And, more and more you see sort of kids' books where I think diversity maybe is more of a prominent topic, whether it's gender or disability or different cultures and stuff. And do you think, is what I was asking, do you think that there's been a change, and is it enough?
Well, I struggle to think of famous female captains, or famous female astronauts, or famous female leaders of business. It's in politics, it's definitely changed, at least here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But broadly speaking, you're right. I can only think of, and I try my best to pay active attention to these conversations. Yeah. And maybe I'm not reading widely enough. I can think of lots of female journalists and authors, but when it comes to in industries like you're talking about, no one springs to mind. And I guess I'm maybe a bit, someone listening to this, watching this is like, you fucking ignorant piece of shit. I'm trying my best. So
I mean, and I think it's a
really good question. I've never seen a female pilot and I've flown on a lot of planes,
And I think this is the problem. I was sort of talking about my experience, and I guess as my full-time work, I work in schools, and maybe I've seen that coming through a little bit more in the literature. This is how we're going to change the future, right? The children are the people that we need to target, because most of us are so far down the road that we're not going to change our habits. But even things like Disney, all those stories that we tell our kids, this is where we instill all these beliefs around men and women and disability and yada yada. So things like Frozen coming out and having a strong female lead, 2 strong female leads in that was like, wow, that's so cool. And I do think that at that younger level, I'm seeing more in kind of the books that we read with our kids and the stories that we have that get into the mainstream. Maybe there is a little bit more addressing that imbalance in gender, in disability, in race, all those kind of things, but it's still not reached the other end. So like you said, CEOs, the pay gap for women, captains on planes, whatever, even though we're sort of pushing it in the bottom, it's still not come out the top.
That's just generational, right?
Is it generational?
I think it's generational.
I hope so. I hope that women feel that there shouldn't be any barriers for them getting into these careers, and I hope that we expose our young minds to such a variety and such an equality of opportunities that the future generations won't even question, oh, why do you have a female captain or whatever. But I don't know. I feel like something goes wrong along the way. We've not quite got it right. I don't know what it is, but
I'm trying to figure that out too. I'm genuinely trying to figure it out. What is the key causative to the gender pay gap? you know, or you know, women roles of leadership and powerful positions.
Yeah.
And I'm trying my best to read like a diverse range of voices to understand that.
Yeah.
And I don't have a strong answer for you, but you know, obviously there has always been like historical exclusion and, you know, really gendered expectations of men and women, and who fits into what role within the family, and then obviously within the workplace. And and we're having really good conversations about breaking that down. But at the moment, we still have pretty entrenched concepts at the top end of things, just like you identify.
Yeah.
And our kids are starting to have these, well, some of our kids are starting to have these chats, because it depends on like, do you go to like an uber liberal progressive school?
Exactly.
Or do you go to like, what are your parents like? That's it.
What are their opinions?
Well, you know, like my work is speaking in schools about sexual violence prevention, pornography, constructs of masculinity. And I'll often talk to a school for a day, like 5 different year groups, and then parents in the evening. And it's often like lots of mums who come to listen to me talk about masculinity. And it kind of, sometimes I'm like, well, if dad's at home talking about check out the tits on that one, and some sort of bullshit, like,
it's funny you say that. Like we had a similar situation in one of my schools. We had a little preppy who I don't think even has a label of anything, but somewhere non-binary spectrum. Some days comes in dressing in stereotypically female, sometimes dressing stereotypically male, whatever, little preppy. We had to get an organization who deal in supporting schools in those kind of conversations out. But it wasn't actually anything to do with the kids. The kids, zero fucks. They were just like, whatever. One day he's got hair in a ponytail, next day it's long, whatever. He, she, no names. It was the parents that couldn't cope. And they were saying, oh, I don't want my child, you know, being influenced by this child. You know, it was the older generation that was struggling with it, which I thought was really interesting. That you know, we have, I hope that that's a hopeful thing for the future. That, you know, if we can instill enough in our children to not have to break down some of those kind of stereotypical behaviors. And like you said, you talk to the school children all day long, whatever, but it's like when they go home to their parents, like, is that being backed up? But hopefully if we can intergenerationally get rid of some of these things and start with the kids, so that then their kids won't have any of those really outdated opinions.
Yeah, it's like any sort of social change progress, right? Like whether we're talking about race or class, which we don't talk about enough, I don't think, or gendered expectations of behavior, then it's going to take time. I feel social media has sped up the conversation, and actually sometimes that's a problem, because there's lots of nuance in any of these sorts of things that needs addressing as well, right? Like I think we can get swept away with groupthink and being seen to say the right thing, but we might not have considered some aspect of it, which is also important. But you know, I think by and large we are, I mean, empirically we are living, environmentally speaking aside, in the best time ever in the world, right? Like we've got,
I think that depends how you define best.
Well, if we're thinking about how do we talk about like the LGBTI community, or like, we do have a long way to go for the rights of girls and women, but it's better than it was. And do you know what I mean? Like we don't live in like a post-racial utopia, but we are identifying like you know, structural exclusion of people of color, and how the justice system might deal with Indigenous people differently to white people, right? Like, we're not there yet, and maybe we never will be, but I would argue that this is still the most evolved we've ever been. We haven't like slid backwards to like some prehistoric time where where we're like burning witches and, do you know?
True. And I think like you're right, like there's so many negative things that come through the connectivity that we all exist in, but there's also that positive availability of information. I think education or being exposed to things is the biggest part, right? Like we were just saying about the more you see women in those industries, the more likely you're going to just internalize that that's an industry that's totally normal to be in or whatever. And I think like with Black Lives Matter and some of those kind of movements, like in my personal sphere, in my little bubble here in Melbourne, maybe I wouldn't been exposed in the way that like some of my friends posting in America could show things and write about things that I now feel maybe more educated about. So there is a kind of benefit of that connectivity bubble that we have through the internet, of being able to at least be more exposed to what's happening in different places in the world, and maybe educate yourself a bit more in that way.
Yeah, definitely.
You look confused.
No. I'm just
agree?
no. I'm pondering. I try and think deep.
Yeah.
I actually try and listen to what the people I'm interviewing are saying, and like let my like at my old brain like what I'm interested in is like I see it's like how do we make these changes authentic, because there's a lot of commercial impetus behind some of this stuff, which makes it superficial. Like there's quite a funny round of memes going around every Pride month. I've seen like gay friends post this, and it's like every Pride month it's like, hey cool kids, like let's all put our rainbow.
Let's see that we're reaching out.
You know what I mean? And then what's actually changing behind the scenes for the rest of the year. And brands know that young people have a real penchant for these conversations about social justice at this moment in time, which is a brilliant fucking thing. And subsequently we see that in like marketing. You know, we see huge companies using the language and image of social justice to sell their products. And that disseminates, at least on a superficial level, the idea. But I do wonder, what is that structurally changing? Because if you're a brand and you're using, say, anti-racist rhetoric and imaging, but you're still paying your Black workers like a very low to minimum wage, or you're using offshore labor that has got no recourse to a labor movement, or like they're working like 18 hours, you're not really fucking doing the work. But
I think this really beautifully dovetails with what we were talking about before, about like the left eating the left. Like I completely agree with everything you're saying.
Now I'm being that asshole guy, right?
No, not at all. I completely agree with what you're saying, but that is a beautiful way of highlighting how in that space there's so many things going on. And so you're talking about like there might be a sort of a public voice that's being put out by these organizations because they recognize that young people are interested in social justice, or in a sphere that I'm more familiar with, for example, environmentalism. You know, a lot of big companies are trying to what we call greenwash and say that we're doing these things, but behind the scenes they're still crap. Absolutely agree with you, they're still crap. However, it is also opening up the conversation, and people are more comfortable with having that conversation, and they're more curious. And whilst, you know, there is all this greenwashing that's going on, when people are comfortable with the idea of greenwashing, you can then in that space have more conversations around, well, actually, you know, you really want to question what is going on. Like you actually, you know, this company might say they're using recycled plastics, but you probably want to go behind the scenes, do your own investigation work, and like actually check on their websites and see if they're following up with the promises that they're making. And so people are maybe more curious. Or for example, the Melbourne Cup, which is just about to happen here in Melbourne, of course, you know, all animal activists here in Melbourne absolutely hate it. It's abhorrent, total waste and disrespect of life. So many horses die every year, yada, yada. This year, obviously, there's been so many protests. This year, I saw an advert the other day, and they were trying to say, we at the Melbourne Cup, you know, we look after all of our animals and we retire them when they're too old, and we do all these pre-race checks to make sure they're fit. So they've obviously responded to that national outcry of like, this is a terrible, terrible thing. And even though that advert is bullshit, and we know that like retiring horses means send them to knackery or whatever, it's actually starting a conversation. And I think in a way, although it's not the best, it's starting to open a space in the same, whether it's social justice or environmentalism or whatever it is. Like in a way, you're at least having a conversation that maybe we wouldn't have had before. I know that I'm probably again going to get shot down in flames for saying that, but you know, it's incremental, right? It's a space that started, a conversation that started, and it's definitely not best practice, and it's definitely not our end goal. But at least maybe you can then start to talk to people about, what did you think about that advert? Like, what do you actually think is going on? Why do you think they're even having to address this? As rather than a world where we would just blindly go to the Melbourne Cup, or we would just blindly buy our things, or you know, not care about social justice. I don't know. Does that make any sense at all?
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And I really love that you push back about. Yeah, I love that you push back out the point I was raising, because it gets like super complicated if you you know, you use the term best practice, right? Like when you're explaining that, which I always thought was just a regular term about like the best way to do things in an organizational structure. I was talking to a woman in America a couple of years back, who was hyper in the space of social justice. She worked for an organization that was about stopping men's violence towards women. And I used the phrase best practice, to which she responded, oh, that's a phrase of like white supremacy. And I was very confused because I'd never heard of that before. I'm like, oh, really? You know? And then it becomes like a bit of a linguistic minefield and nightmare.
Oh God, now I feel awful.
No, don't, because I don't
explain why I use that phrase.
No, you don't have to. That's what I'm trying to say. It's like, I think as people who want to make change, we're actually our own worst enemies. Like, and we shouldn't get hung up on nuances. Or
I use that phrase because I come from a medical background, and we're always talking clinically about best practice. But even now that you've mentioned it, it is interesting because when I talk about best practice, I talk about, and I'm talking clinically now in terms of what I work in my speech pathology job, it's practice that's backed up by evidence. It's proven to work. That's what I mean.
That's what I mean too.
Other organizations will say, well, we're using best practice in delivering this particular medical model or whatever. But if you don't have any evidence backing it, then you can't call it best practice. And that's what I mean. So maybe that's where that, for me, it comes from. Like, you're not just saying that you're doing it, but you're actually backing it up with evidence that shows that you followed through. That's
precisely the context that I was using in it too. It's like, what does all the research and the thought leaders and say behind the way that we're doing this thing? And I guess the point I'm saying is that it can be, I don't know, like a tricky space to find yourself in, when language is always changing and everyone's got like different interpretations of language, and yet you all want the same sort of positive outcomes.
You do. And that's where that shame and embarrassment comes into it, when you're like, oh, I'm too nervous. You know, for years, I really hesitated trying to get engaged in conversations around politics because I just felt like I didn't know enough, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing, especially when it came to things like, you know, feminism or like social injustices and stuff. Like, there's so many people who can be so critical that if you don't come from a point where you feel confident in your knowledge, or I would say that for me personally, it put me off even engaging in those conversations. I suppose when you look at that, there's the other end of the spectrum of people who believe that they have all the information, overconfidently enter into that space and then spout a load of crap. So I think like conservative people would maybe like reflect and maybe not want to engage in conversations where they don't feel like they have enough information, or that they might get bashed for saying the wrong thing. And I think that's a problem. And that's a barrier for people engaging in those kind of trying to make changes or bring about movements, whatever. Like, we've got to be incorporating everyone, even if you say the wrong or terminology is a bit out of date. We need to be sort of supporting each other gently, rather than kind of calling each other out, like exactly like we said right back at the beginning, you know, wrong, you said it wrong, your way of doing things are wrong. And that's actually just going to lead to people not stepping back and not caring. They're just overwhelmed. It's too difficult. I don't want to even have the conversation because I'm just going to get attacked for it, or say the wrong thing, or feel embarrassed. I think that's a big barrier to all of those changing anything conversations.
Yeah, I really agree with your take there. Hey, to finish, what do you do to take care of yourself? Because it's a lot that you do. It's a lot that you think about, you know, like I imagine you've seen some horrible images with you know, like what do you do for self-care?
I suppose that's a great question. I think surrounding myself with people who have, you know, similar opinions. So like I I get to debrief a lot of the things that I see with my Sea Shepherd friends and colleagues. And I think it's just really important to have a conversation and explain things that you've gone through, and taking that time to even just talk about things that you're feeling or experiencing, because even just the process of speaking about it, it feels like I offload a lot of some of the things that I've been through. I have a friend that I see every year after campaign in LA. She's a best friend from years ago, and most of the time that I see her in LA, she just listens to me where I go, blah, this thing happened and this thing happened and this thing happened. She doesn't really have to say anything. It's just an offloading and a space where I consciously kind of talk through everything, so I can kind of get it out of my mind. And yeah, I think just leaning on my friends for that is probably the main thing that I do in terms of like debriefing after the fact, I suppose. Yeah.
I like that. It's like most of us, some sort of like professional supervision to offload. It's what everyone should do, really. You can't carry
totally.
everything around in your head all the time, just even if you're not in an activist space. But I think people who do the sort of work you do particularly need to take care of themselves lest they burn out. Hey, Kate, you're the best. I really admire what you do.
Likewise.
And I really admire how you do it. And I really appreciate you sharing your insights about a gentler approach to change making. I think a lot of people need to hear that at this moment in time. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me along and letting me chat about all this.
No, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it. All right. Well, keep in touch, huh?
Yeah, take care.